Kōnstantînos Palaiológos, also known as Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor. But what about the Constantine of Fate Grand Order? How old does he compare to his historical counterpart, and what grade would I give his depiction? Let's get into it. Obligatory spoiler warning for Lost Belt 6.5, Traum. Actually, quick question. How much time should pass before I skip the spoiler warnings for main story content? When it concerned Lost Belt 6, I stopped giving spoiler warnings for Lost Belt 6 after it was 6 months old. Is that a reasonable time frame? Let me know in the comments. Also, while I know that the NA version went with the Greek name Konstantinos, I'm going to call him Constantine throughout this video because I'm less likely to screw up the pronunciation. Call me lazy if you want, because it's totally true in this case. Anyway, let's continue. Constantine is a rider-class servant, which does work for him. Constantine was the last emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire. I'll talk about the whole Byzantine thing later. Constantine XI was very much a soldier emperor, leading his armies in battle. He is often depicted as riding a horse, as leaders tended to do, was known as a good horse rider even from an early age, had a horse killed from underneath him in a battle in 1429, well before he actually became emperor, and depictions of him both during his final moments and in monuments depict him as riding atop a horse. At the very least, rider seems like the best class choice for him. Getting into his character design, Constantine, regardless of his ascension form, has a tendency to dress fancy. His first ascension is how we first meet him in the Chaldea Boys 2024 event, dressed up in a nice suit that, well, it's certainly more modern, and so this isn't something the real Constantine would have worn. His other two ascensions are much better, with him wearing light armor in his second ascension, while in his third he is fully dressed up for battle. Now, on the one hand, I'm a little nitpicky about this design, specifically the colors that are used. The color purple, particularly the shade known as Tyrian purple, is commonly associated with Eastern Roman emperors, as is the concept of being born in the purple, or a child who was born to parents when those parents were already reigning emperors. Constantine XI himself was born in the purple, since he was born in 1404 while his father Manuel II's reign began in 1391. Yet the color we get here isn't quite right, it seems more magenta than purple to me. On the other hand, his third ascension armor is white, which, while not being anything like the depictions of Constantine, may itself be an allusion to him being known as the Marble Emperor. A legend formed that Constantine XI had not actually died in battle, but had been taken away by angels, turned into marble, and hidden underneath Constantinople's walls until it was time to retake the city and the old empire from the Turks. Kinda like how King Arthur is called the once and future king. Obviously, this hasn't happened yet after 571 years, but who knows, maybe it will. So when it comes to Constantine's design, it's decent enough, depicting him as someone with expensive clothes who was more soldier than administrator, which very much rings true for the real Constantine. I'm just being a little pedantic about the colors. Moving into his skill set, Constantine's first skill is Hagia Sophia's Prayer, which increases his NP gain for a turn, applies taunt to himself, and is also a star bomb. The Hagia Sophia is a massive cathedral in the city of Constantinople built during the reign of Justinian during the years 532 to 537. It was the largest cathedral in the world for nearly 1,000 years, and is probably the most famous example of Eastern Roman or Byzantine architecture in existence. You actually get a brief glimpse of the Hagia Sophia in Constantine's MP animation when it is showing the city under siege. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, it was converted into a mosque by its new Turkish rulers, where they added those 4 minarets around the building. It would be converted into a museum in 1935, but then was converted back into a mosque in the year 2020, which was more than a little controversial, but let's leave it at that. Anyway, so what does this have to do with Constantine XI aside from him having ruled the city where this landmark is located? Well, the night before what proved to be his last day alive, he and much of the rest of the population of Constantinople gathered in the Hagia Sophia, giving prayers and asking for forgiveness as the Ottoman assault seemed imminent. In other words, the skill name Hagia Sophia's Prayer is literally something Constantine XI did the night before his final battle. Constantine's second skill is Empire's Decline, which increases attack and buster card effectiveness for 3 turns for all allies, as well as boosting critical strength for all Roman allies for 3 turns. Much like his first skill, this one has a very obvious link to Constantine, since he was the last emperor of the Byzantines, or Eastern Rome. Though, one thing about that, normally when you are looking at the last leader of a dying empire, you are typically seeing one of 2 types of people. Either the final ruler made some fatal mistakes and so was a major reason why that empire collapsed, or they were literally a child, and it was their parents or guardians who made those final mistakes. In Constantine XI's case though, by all accounts, he was actually pretty competent, being a skilled general and a capable administrator. It's just, he had the misfortune of being born into an empire that had been dying for centuries, and was now very much on its last legs. And while I don't really like to get into counterfactuals, if he had actually received the aid that he hoped for, it's not impossible to imagine that Constantine XI could have saved his empire. It just didn't turn out that way. Lastly, Constantine's third skill is Demise Privilege, giving himself an MP charge, critical strength for 3 turns, and star generation for 3 turns. But also for the next 3 turns, this skill will give all of these same buffs to an ally from the back line if Constantine is defeated, aside from Constantine himself, assuming you have a second one. This is actually a variation on the skill Imperial Privilege, which, actually I've not covered a servant who has that yet, have I? So to make it short, Imperial Privilege is a skill where a character uses their authority in order to acquire skills that they normally wouldn't be able to use. Naturally, you see it most on monarch characters, such as Nero, Cleopatra, and Wu Zetian. In Constantine's case though, he was the last emperor of Eastern Rome, and so his form of Imperial Privilege has a twist. That while his version of the skill isn't particularly strong, he is able to pass on those benefits to another. Now, Constantine XI had no heir or successor. He was the last emperor of Eastern Rome. But others did claim to be the inheritors of the legacy of Eastern Rome, namely the Ottoman Turks who conquered it, as well as the Russian Tsars. To be honest, this is the weirdest part of his kit, since while those 2 empires did claim to be his heirs, Constantine XI certainly didn't choose either of them.
いや、断じて滅びはせぬ。テオドシウス・コンスタンティノス。私はここにいる。ここにいるぞ。我々こそが真なる壁なのだ。
Constantinos XI's noble phantasm is Theodosius Konstantinos, bringing us back in time to the city that he defended, Constantinople, applying its great defenses on behalf of his allies. This MP gives a slew of buffs to him and his allies. Increased Buster Card effectiveness for 3 turns, invincibility 1 time for 1 turn, greatly increased defense for a turn depending upon overcharge, and a damage cut to Roman allies for a turn. Constantine XI's most famous moment in life was his last stand against the Ottoman Turks in 1453, defending the city of Constantinople. I'll be saying more about the siege itself later, but for now, a few words about the walls that feature in this MP. The first walls for Constantinople were built by the first Constantine, Constantine the Great, and his son during the 4th century. But it was the walls built during the reign of Theodosius II, between 402 and 450, that became the most famous and are the ones this MP refers to, the Theodosian walls. They consisted of a large inner wall, a smaller outer wall, and then a moat with another tiny wall between the moat and the outer wall. If this sounds like it would be a nightmare to try to break through, that's because it was. Attila the Hun, one of history's most famous conquerors who rampaged through both halves of the Roman Empire, took one look at Constantinople's walls and decided, nope, I'm not going to try that. Others would try, though. Multiple Muslim caliphates, the Bulgarian Empire, the Rus, Crusaders, the Ottomans, and many more. 26 sieges between 324 and 1453. Most of them failed. The only ones that succeeded were some Byzantine civil wars, the Crusaders in 1204, and finally the Ottomans in 1453, where Constantine XI made his final stand. It's one of the most besieged cities in history, with perhaps only Jerusalem being attacked more often, and that city has traded hands far more often than Constantinople. As for this MP's critical weakness, we will get into that later. Constantine's craft essence is All Fades to Dust, featuring the aftermath of the fall of Constantinople. The CE's text delves into his thoughts about that, which are understandably filled with sorrow and regrets over the fate of his people. Like many conquests throughout history, when Constantinople fell, the invading Turks rampaged through the city for 3 days. The city was thoroughly ransacked, many atrocities occurred, and much of the remaining population of between 30 and 50,000 people were enslaved by the Turks. It wasn't completely destroyed. Mehmed II wanted the city for his new capital, Constantine, so it needed to be at least somewhat intact. The city did recover quickly, And today, Istanbul, with nearly 16 million people, is the biggest city in Europe, with nearly a fifth of modern Turkey's population. But all of that likely wouldn't be reassuring to those who were brutalized, assaulted, or enslaved in 1453. Little wonder that the servant Constantine would be saddened by that fate, that he was the last emperor of a nation that had lasted for 2,200 years, and that it came to such an end. In the CE text, Constantine blames himself, his failure to protect his people. We of course do not know how the real Constantine may have felt. He was killed in the battle after all, but it isn't hard to imagine that these are the sorts of thoughts he might have had about it. Looking into the future, Constantine's Valentines CE is Emperor Surcoats Plus, featuring some light armor with a tabard featuring Chaldea's logo. Admittedly, this armor looks more like something that would come out of Western Europe, whereas the Byzantine army tended to dress in a style that blended Western and Eastern elements. I'm a little torn on being nitpicky about this, since the defenders of Constantinople themselves were a hodgepodge mix of soldiers, militia, Italian troops from Genova and Venice, basically whoever Constantine could scrounge together for the final battle. As for the CE's text, it's basically information on the armor itself, as well as advice on wearing it, certainly information that would come in handy for the protagonist receiving it. At the very least, it does fit Constantine since he was very much a soldier, and so this is the sort of thing he would want to give to someone going into battle together with him. Me fussing about the armor not being quite right is just me being pedantic again. Now for characterization, starting with a look into the history of Constantînos XI, the last Roman emperor. And I know some of you might be scratching their heads at that. Wasn't Constantine a Byzantine emperor of the Byzantine Empire? Well, yes he was. But the name Byzantine Empire only actually started to appear after the fall of Eastern Rome in 1453. The so-called Byzantines never actually called themselves the Byzantines. They called themselves the Roman Empire, the continuation of 2,200 years of history starting from the foundation of Rome. Now, while it is true that the Eastern Roman Empire centered around Constantinople was distinct from its Western counterpart, being more Greek than Latin, Byzantine Empire is a historical distinction, a way of separating two different phases of the Roman Empire. So while calling them Byzantines is fine, and I will continue to do so throughout this video, during his lifetime Constantine XI would have been considered a Roman emperor, and ultimately the last one. Kōnstantînos Palaiológos was born in the year 1404, the fourth son of Emperor Manuel II and his empress consort Helena Dragash, later the Orthodox saint Hippomone. Little is known about his early years, but it is said that he was brave and had a talent for military skills even from an early age. He would get his first taste of action in 1422 at the age of 18, when the Ottomans laid siege to Constantinople. And now is probably a good time to bring up the situation that Constantine and his empire faced, because this was no longer the empire of Justinian or Basil II. Those days were long gone. Between the disastrous defeat at Manzikert in 1071, the Crusaders' sack and occupation of Constantinople in 1204, and the Roman penchant for corruption and civil war, the Eastern Roman Empire was, by the time of Constantine XI, barely holding on, only owning the city of Constantinople itself, Morea, the Peloponnesus, and a few scattered islands. Against them was the new rising power of the Ottomans, who had now pushed the Byzantines to being little more than a vassal, with clear intent to take what was left of the Roman Empire. But 1422 would not be that moment. The Romans fought back the Ottoman siege, with Constantine XI being among its defenders. Since this too will become important later, a few notes about Constantinople. Though it had fallen far from its glory days and had only perhaps 50,000 inhabitants when it had once been the largest city in the world, it was ancient, full of wondrous monuments like the aforementioned Hagia Sophia, and incredibly well defended by the Theodosian walls. Even if the Byzantines were all but gone, the city was still formidable and of immense strategic importance, as it still is today. But there were warning signs that the next siege after the one in 1422 might be trouble, for the Ottomans had brought a new weapon against the great walls of Constantinople: falconets, small cannons, which were a new invention. But the Ottomans had to lift their siege thanks to a revolt staged by Sultan Murad II's brother, a revolt partially funded by the Byzantines to help relieve the siege. This was one of the only ways the Byzantines still had to fight back, and so naturally they used it. Shortly after this, Manuel II suffered a stroke, and though his mind remained intact, he did not have much longer to live. His eldest son John, Constantine's eldest brother, effectively took charge of the empire. John in turn had taken note of Constantine's participation in the defense of Constantinople, considering him to be the most talented of his younger brothers. When John went overseas to try to get assistance from Venice and Hungary for when the Ottomans would inevitably try to take the city again, he left Constantine in charge as regent for their ailing father, despite him being the fourth son. After John returned and their father Manuel II died shortly afterwards, the new Emperor John VIII made Constantine the new despot, or lord, of Morea, the Peloponnesus. It was a sign of his rising favor, with it now being seen that if the childless John were to die, then perhaps Constantine should become the emperor after him. As you might expect, this didn't exactly sit well with their other siblings, and there would be conflict between them in the coming years, notably his fifth brother Demetrios, who later tried to take the throne. During Constantine's tenure ruling Morea, he captured the port city of Patras, fought off the state of Epirus, and again served as regent for his brother John when he went off to Italy to negotiate with the Western Christians. Negotiate what, you ask? Well, like his previous visit to the West, Emperor John was trying to get help from the West against the Ottomans, but the price being asked was to merge the Eastern and Western churches, with the Western Pope being in charge. Since the Eastern Orthodox Christians already had their own traditions, plus the fact that, Western Christians had sacked and occupied Constantinople for over half a century, this was deeply unpopular among the Roman populace. The choice was basically between saying no to the deal and so being crushed by the Ottomans, or making the deal and being overthrown by their own people. Or, as it turned out, do the deal, watch the Crusader army get crushed by the Ottomans at the Battle of Varna in 1444, and so be left with the worst of both worlds. Constantine tried to help by attacking from Morea towards Athens, but the victorious Ottoman army moved south and defeated him, with Constantine only barely managing to escape. And so Emperor John, with Constantine who supported his efforts, were left with few allies, a dangerous enemy, and a population who didn't exactly appreciate the proposed subservience to the Pope. A few years later, there would be a changing of the guard in both Eastern Rome and the Ottoman Empire. In 1448, Constantine's brother John died without any children, with the throne now passing to him, being crowned as Constantine XI. 3 years later, the Sultan Murad II died, allowing his young and ambitious son Mehmed II to fully take over. At first, the two rulers got along, but then Constantine acquired a mild case of complete and utter idiocy. A pretender to the Ottoman throne lived in Constantinople, and the Eastern Romans were given money every year to make sure that he stayed there. The Byzantines sent a message to Mehmed II that the money wasn't enough, and that unless it was increased, they would let this pretender go free, almost certainly leading to a civil war within the Ottoman Empire. Upon hearing this, Mehmed II was enraged, deciding that now was the time to take Constantinople once and for all. Constantine XI had made a fatal error, and this time, there would be no army from the west coming to their aid. In preparing for battle, Mehmed II didn't take any chances. He built a castle on the opposite side of the Bosphorus from Constantinople, gathered an army of around 80,000, more than the entire population of Constantinople, and even had parts of his fleet dragged overland in order to bypass the chain that blocked the Golden Horn. But, most critically, he had acquired the services of an engineer who built Mehmed II a gargantuan cannon. Ironically, this engineer, a Hungarian named Orban, no, not that one, had first offered his services to Constantine, but he could not afford it, and so Orban went to the Turks instead, who gave him everything he needed to build one of the largest cannons ever made. I wonder how the engineer Orban would feel if he knew that, around 70 years later, the empire he built this cannon for would go conquer his own homeland, dominating it for the next 150 years. He got paid, so he probably wouldn't care. The defenses of Constantinople were formidable, but they were built for medieval sieges, not artillery bombardments. Against all of this, Constantine XI had, at best, 7,000 troops to defend his capital. Mehmed II did offer to allow Constantine to retreat to Morea if he would surrender the city, but he refused, stating that he would be an emperor without an empire, and that if the city was to fall, he would go down with it. The siege would last for 53 days. The night before the final assault, Constantine and his people would gather in the Hagia Sophia for prayer, as I mentioned before. Unfortunately, in the midst of all this, some Venetian troops had left one of the gates unlocked, in the middle of a siege, something you only really see if there's either betrayal or boneheaded idiocy involved. The Ottoman assault began at midnight, and though the defenders did their best to fight back, between the weeks of bombardment, that one gate being left open, and the fact that the Ottomans outnumbered them 10-1, defeat was inevitable. We don't have any solid first-hand accounts of how exactly it happened, but Constantine XI died during this final battle, having fought to the end to defend his city. While he was not well regarded during his life thanks to his and his brothers accepting the authority of the Pope, his decision to fight to the end turned Constantine into a martyr for the Greeks. The legend of the Marble Emperor was created, the bit about him maybe coming back one day to take the city back. And Constantine XI continues to be seen as a hero in Greece up to the present day. As for Mehmed II, he became known as the Conqueror for taking Constantinople, and since he was still only 21 years old, he had plenty more time to reign and expand his empire. This he would do, massively expanding Ottoman territory during his life, the purple parts on this map. But in 1462, less than a decade after this great victory, Mehmed II would face off against another Christian ruler, one that would make him no fear. But don't worry, we will be getting into his video in the not too distant future. Moving into Fate Grand Order, we first meet Constantine in the 15 Bespectacled Intellectuals event, or Chaldea Boys 2024. He keeps his identity hidden for a good chunk of that event, giving the name Michael. He calls it a common name, but it is also a name used by past Byzantine emperors. There were 9 of them actually, with the 8th being the first emperor of Constantine's own Palaiológos dynasty, and the 9th being Constantine's great-great-grandfather. In this event, he is an ally, but he ended up getting his powers stolen by the monsters in the building. He's rather embarrassed about that, which is why he doesn't tell you who he is right away. But once it comes time to come up with a plan to defeat these power-stealing enemies, he has little choice but to tell you what power exactly he had stolen from him. With some foreshadowing, you leave the event with him telling you that the next time you meet, it may be again as allies, or as enemies. As it turns out, it ends up being the latter in the Traum Singularity, for Constantine leads the Reinstatement realm in the 3-way conflict there. While Kriemhild's realm is focused on taking revenge upon proper history, Constantine's realm focuses upon trying to right injustices that occurred during proper history. At first glance, that certainly makes sense for him. He was born as the son of a dying empire, and as talented as he was, he could not save it. His enemy was a rising superpower, and his potential allies were too caught up in their own affairs to help, only to seriously regret it later. It wasn't really Constantine's fault that his empire fell. Yes, he did have that massive fail by provoking Mehmed II, but chances are Mehmed II would have attacked someday anyway. He was a young new sultan looking to make a name for himself, and he certainly did, being regarded as among the best Ottoman sultans to ever live. On another note, I'm wondering if we might get Mehmed II as a servant someday, or perhaps another Ottoman sultan like Suleiman the Magnificent. Turkey feels seriously underrepresented in Fate, and seeing interactions between Mehmed, Constantine, and Vlad could be fun. But despite all that, it's not actually his own grievances against the injustice of history that Constantine is focused upon, but rather that of another, Popes Johanna. Now, Johanna is a pretty interesting character, but sadly a video on her is going to have to wait until after Valentines 2025 since she is the star character there. If my videos on Sherlock and Moriarty taught me anything, it's that I probably shouldn't do videos on characters when it is already clear that the character will have more major story appearances. It's why I probably can't revisit Marie Antoinette until after Ordeal Call 2 releases on NA. Anyway, Johanna is a female pope said to have reigned between the years 855 to 857, a little less than half a century after the death of Charlemagne, but her existence is now believed to be fictional, though it's still debated. Believing it to be a great injustice that she was erased from history, Constantine and the rest of the Reinstatement realm seeks to right that wrong, to make sure that Johanna is reinstated back into the historical record. Later, it is said that Constantine might have fallen in love with Johanna, but we never get to hear it from him personally. Constantine XI had been married twice during his life, but sadly both of his wives would die only a year into their marriages, the first during a stillbirth in 1429, and the second from illness in 1442, and he would not marry again before his death in 1453. As for his leadership of the Reinstatement realm, for much of the time Constantine fights in defensive battles against the Revenge realm. It's certainly a style of war he's familiar with, but when it comes time to launch an attack against the Righteous realm, he proves to be fairly competent at that too, again just as he was in life. Ironically, he's actually up against Vlad III, who both fought against the Ottoman Empire, the same sultan no less, when they were both still alive. In this battle, Constantine ends up winning on the field, but is then pushed back when Charlemagne reveals himself, managing to overpower his defensive MP. It's actually kind of fitting that it's Charlemagne who overpowers his defenses, because as I mentioned in my video on Charlemagne, while he himself wasn't a crusader, the fictional one from the legends, the one Saber Charlemagne is largely based upon, is treated like one, and it was Crusaders who managed to overpower the Theodosian walls and take Constantinople in the year 1204. Popes Johanna convinces Constantine to fall back, knowing that the righteous realm has been severely weakened, but pressing on in a duel with Charlemagne could undo that. But Constantine would not get the chance to plan his next step, because on the journey home, he is sniped by the Revenge Realm's archer, Minamoto no Tametomo. His MP is a formidable defense, but it having one weak spot, thanks to how in history that one gate had been left open, and the fact that Johanna can't be protected by his walls due to her fictional existence, he ends up taking Tametomo's shot for Johanna, which is exactly what Kriemhild wanted anyway. Fatally wounded and with the Revenge Realm's army storming in, Constantine convinces Johanna and Bradamante to escape to the Righteous Realm, while he and those who wish to remain fight to the end. In this final battle, Constantine ends up reenacting the final moments of his own life, a desperate, unwinnable battle against an overwhelming opponent. He muses about this as he fights, wondering if he is cursed before he is finally taken down. Much like his story in real life, as sad as it is that he died in a hopeless battle, at least you can't say that he went down quietly. He stayed true to himself to the end, both in life and as a servant in Traum. As for future events or story content, he recently got an interlude on JP. I don't know what his future appearances are about, but honestly, that doesn't matter. His role in the Traum Singularity is more than enough to solidify his character, and to compare it very favorably with his historical counterpart. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Constantine's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Well, his character design and skill set are excellent, even if I did get a little nitpicky about the color being not the right shade of purple. The same is the case for his Valentines CE being a gift of armor that probably wasn't quite what he or his own troops probably wore. I'm just being a pedantic ass. But there is also his third skill, which is a bit weird by having him nominate a successor when he never actually did that in real life. But when it comes to characterization, it's pretty impressive. While he did appear in Chaldea Boys 2024, it's the events of Traum where he truly gets to shine. He is portrayed as a competent, decent ruler, though admittedly that's easy when he's being compared against Kriemhild, whose very first scene in Traum has her murdering some of her subordinates for failure. Constantine's skill as both a general and combatant are proven during his battle against the Righteous Realm. But most of all, it's his final stand against the Revenge Realm that is most memorable, playing out much like his own death in real life. While I can nitpick and be a bud about a few details, I can't really argue that the developers didn't do a good job with Constantine, because they most certainly did. And so for a final grade, I'm going to give Constantine XI, or Kōnstantînos Palaiológos, an A-. If you would like to learn more about another champion revered in Greece, check out my video on Heracles here. Until next time.